Know your own being as it is, not as it might become, not an enlightened being or a special kind of being that some evolved people have that others don't have, the being that shines in the midst of everyone's experience. The being that shares none of the limitations of experience itself. In other words, the being that is impersonal, that is, shares none of the personal qualities of our thoughts, images, feelings, etc. Impersonal, but at the same time utterly intimate. In fact, not even intimate, closer than intimate. Intimate is something or someone that is close to us. Our own being is not close to us, it is us. It is closer than close. We have never for a moment been anything other than this being, this infinite, self-aware being. There are no other beings that it would be possible to be. Just as the space of this room is and has always been and will always be the only space there ever is in the universe, a single, infinite, indivisible space. So the being in each of us, or rather the being that is us, is the only infinite, self-aware being that there is. God's infinite being. We do not become this through a practice of meditation or a spiritual tradition. It is simply ignored and then remembered, veiled and then revealed. But it is not veiled by something other than itself. There is nothing other than itself with which it could be veiled. Our own being veils itself with its own activity. This pure knowing or pure consciousness assumes the activities of thinking and perceiving. And as such, seems to endarken itself with its own creativity, its own activity. And then as this activity relaxes, its essence or nature shines. Its essence or nature has not been transformed. It has not evolved. It has not become enlightened. Our being, which is not our being. In other words, our being doesn't belong to us, a person or a body. We should just say being, infinite, self-aware being, which shines in all our experience, but is not limited to our experience, is always in the same condition. Like the space of this room, it is colorless, transparent, empty, luminous, knowing. Imperturbable. Lacking nothing. Nothing that ever happens in experience adds anything to or removes anything from. this infinite self-aware being. It is inherently complete, fulfilled. The common name for this completion or fulfillment is simply happiness, or the absence of lack.
I'm assuming that it is natural for consciousness to be veiled, or
to be veiled. Yes.
However, there is a natural impulse to wake up.
Yes.
I mean, every single conflict or issue is just a signal for us to wake up.
Yes.
So why is that? What is if the impulse has a clear purpose, what is the purpose of consciousness to be veiled?
For the sake of manifestation.
For the sake
of manifestation.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on this?
If the screen did not veil itself with the movie, there would just be a blank screen. There would be no movie. So if consciousness did not veil itself with its own activity, there would be no creation. There would just be formless consciousness.
But here we are assuming that what is projected into the screen veils the screen, but why it should be that way?
Because consciousness... in just the same way that when we have a dream at night, we dream a world within our own mind, but we cannot view the dreamed world directly from the perspective of our mind. Our mind has to fall asleep to itself and enter into its own imagination and seem to become a separate subject of experience in that dream. And it is only from the perspective of the separate subject of experience that the dreamer's mind can know itself as the world. So the dreamer has to fall asleep in order to manifest the dream world within itself. Consciousness cannot know the world directly. Let me explain why that is so. So at the moment, you view these flowers from a single point of view, yes? Each of us is viewing these flowers from a single point of view, and you have one view of the flower. Now, imagine that you could view the flowers from 2 points of view. Say the point of view where you are now and the point of view behind it. Okay, and now superimpose these 2 points of view on top of each other, like 2 slides on top of each other, and then you view the image of the flower. Now imagine that you can view the flower from 4 points of view, and you put these 4 slides on top of each other. Well, what would you see? Well, they're all superimposed on top of each other. So you'd see one kind of blurred image of a flower. And now imagine that you saw it not from 4 points of view, but from 8 points of view. What would it look like? You're viewing the flower from 8 different points of view, and you're superimposing all those points of view on top of each other, and then you're looking at that single image. What would it look like?
Just like a not as a flower, but as a dot.
Perfect. It would be a kind of blur of pink. It wouldn't really look like a flower. Mm-hmm. Now, instead of viewing it from 8 points of view, imagine 100 points of view. Superimpose them all on top of each other. What would it look like?
I would see something like a marble, perhaps. At least
just a blur of color.
Yeah.
Okay. Now imagine that you were able to view the flower from every point in space. That's how consciousness is all-pervading. That's how if consciousness could see the flower directly, it would see it from all possible points of view in the universe simultaneously, what would the flower look like?
Even from inside the flower?
Even from all the points of view inside the flower. What would, and this infinite number of views of the flower, consciousness would register it as one thing. What would it look like? It would be the deepest, darkest blackness you could ever imagine. It would be like Malievich's black square, yes? Just pure black. In other words, consciousness could not see an object directly. All it could see, if it saw every object from every point of view in the universe, it would just be this immensely black image. So in order to see an object, consciousness has to consent to become a subject. It has to consent to fall asleep to itself and to localize and to wake up as a finite mind. That's why there's this beautiful line in the Bhagavad Gita when what is night for consciousness is daytime for the mind, and what is night for the mind is daytime for consciousness. Let me translate that. When consciousness falls asleep, the finite mind wakes up. When the finite mind falls asleep, consciousness wakes up. So consciousness has to, which is in fact exactly what happens when your mind falls asleep at night. The character that you seem to become in your dream wakes up. And when the character in the dream falls asleep, you, the dreamer, wake up. It's the same thing. Consciousness has to fall asleep to itself in order to localize itself at a point of view. That's what we are. We are points of view in consciousness, from whose perspective consciousness is then able to know something called an object. In the absence of that point of view, infinite consciousness cannot know an object. The infinite cannot know the infinite. The infinite cannot know the finite, and the finite cannot know the infinite. The infinite can only know the infinite. So in consciousness's direct experience, there is just itself, its own dimensionless, formless, luminous, empty, transparent present. If it wants to, which is a field of pure potential in which nothing is yet actualized. In order to actualize its potential, it has to overlook its infinite nature and consent to become a separate self or finite mind. In other words, this separation and its attendant suffering is the price consciousness pays for manifestation.
And when consciousness ends its mission, then this condensation is going to be dissolved. Yes.
When consciousness, so consciousness contracts itself into the finite mind, and then as it decontracts, it goes back, so to speak, to itself. But it's doing this at all different times, so it can be contracted in one mind, and it completely decontracted in another mind. Remember the image last night of the night watchman's screen? Were you here last night?
Yeah.
On the night watchman's screen, there can be numerous images. Each image relays the information from one of the cameras on the construction site. And some of the images could be blank, and some of the images there are people walking around, and some of the images there's nothing happening. But it's all on the same screen. All made out of the same indivisible consciousness.
All of a sudden, I now know why I'm here.
And this contraction of consciousness into the finite mind inevitably involves the overlooking of the innate peace and fulfillment that is the nature of consciousness. And that's why I said this morning, at the heart of all finite minds or separate selves, that there is this wound, this feeling of this search to be relieved of limitations, this desire to go back to our natural state of openness, of fullness, of peace, of completion. if you imagine compressing a ball, there is this force in the compressed ball that is always tending to go back to its natural state of equilibrium. Well, the separate self is the compressed ball, contracted consciousness that is always tending to go back to its natural state of peace or happiness. And that is all separate self. It is all any separate self truly wants, is to be divested of its separation or its contraction and to be restored to its original nature. Whether we are as I said this morning, whether we are a scientist seeking knowledge, whether we are somebody seeking intimacy and relationship, whether we are an artist seeking beauty, whether we are, whatever we are seeking, what we are really seeking is the taste of our true nature. Or our true nature is attracting itself back to itself.
So the question becomes, because I decided to reread Nature of Consciousness to prepare or something, and I noticed through it, periodically there's these things in the borders that have a theme to them, and I guess oh yes, there was that and that. So I just want to ask this. So here is what you wrote. Consciousness, and we've gone through this, but consciousness dreams the world within itself and simultaneously loses itself in its own dream, seeming, as a result, to become a separate subject of experience within that dream, from whose perspective the dreamed world may be known. Thus, the subject-object relationship is the medium through which the infinite appears to itself as the finite. The subject and the object are two sides of the same, overlooking, ignoring, or forgetting the consciousness. And I wrote, this is years ago, really crazy. How could a finite mind, no matter how refined, or a lineage of finite minds, no matter how refined, could suggest this is known? How would finite minds know this? By experience.
Because the knowing with which the apparently finite mind knows its finite knowledge is not itself finite.
Say that once more.
The knowing with which the apparently finite mind knows its knowledge is not itself finite.
Got it. Oh.
The knowing with which King Lear knows his experience has nothing to do with the character of King Lear. It belongs to John Smith. King Lear feels, I know my experience, but that I belongs to John Smith, not King Lear. So the I in each of us that knows or is aware of our finite experience is itself infinite consciousness.
I mean, this framework is a frame of reference that's just so profound and deep and layers. It's remarkable that so-called finite minds can perceive this as truth. You know, it's like. But what you're saying, the lineage, Advaita Vedanta lineage, it came through many so-called finite minds to this understanding, or it's just your interpretation.
Because remember, it's always that the intelligence in every single mind is the same intelligence. That intelligence is sometimes dulled by the mind in which it shines, and as a result that intelligence sometimes comes out in unintelligent ways. But even the intelligence in an unintelligent expression is still the only intelligence there is, the intelligence of infinite consciousness. Each of us are intelligent. The intelligence in each of our minds is the intelligence of consciousness. It is the qualities of each of our finite minds that modulates that infinite intelligence, and therefore there are numerous different expressions of that intelligence. But however intelligent or unintelligent those expressions are, they are all expressions of the same intelligence. It's a beautiful thing William Blake said, all things possible to be believed are an image of truth. Ramana Maharshi's thoughts, the Buddha's thoughts, Hitler's thoughts, all of our thoughts, they are all an image, a representation of the only intelligence there is, what William Blake called truth, or intelligence, understanding.
When you talked before about the permeability of minds, that's connected to this, yes? It's the coherence of many so-called infinite minds in connection through that permeability that would surface this.
Imagine a white piece of paper, and on the white piece of paper, draw innumerable circles, but draw them with perforated lines. So imagine a white piece of paper, you've taken out your pencil, you've drawn lots of little circles with perforated lines. Okay, the white piece of paper represents consciousness. The perforated lines represent each of our minds. But the stuff inside each of our minds, the bit of the white paper inside the circle, it's the same sheet of paper. The paper is not limited by the little perforated circle that is superimposed on top of it. It is the same intelligence shining in all minds. Now, if you, with your pencil, if you shade some of the circles, grey them out, the white paper will shine less brightly through that shading. If you shade very heavily, the white paper will barely show at all through the shading. But it's all the same paper, expressing through innumerable different minds with more or less light. But it's not the light itself that varies. It's the film of our thought or feelings that temper the light. Another analogy, that the sun is always shining brightly, and that part of the earth that is facing the sun shines with the sun's light, but that part of the earth that is turned away from the sun is in darkness. It's the same. That part of our finite mind that turns towards its source shines with its intelligence. But a mind that is completely turned away from its source is a mind which is ignorant and, as a result, capable of unkind, unjust, untrue thoughts and actions.
Thank you.
It seems as though the veiled, the veiled experience is actually the magic. The veiled experience is where the magic lies, and that we can create this hypnotic world to live in, and that the aware experience is not all that. I don't know what the right word is, but it seems normal.
Yes. But to begin with, if objective experience has been our norm, or if the apparent reality of objective experience has been our norm, then the discovery of the transparent experience of being aware, or pure knowing, or awareness itself, seems extraordinary by comparison, because it shares none of the qualities of the ordinary. our thoughts, images, feelings, etc. So it seems at first to be extraordinary. But in time, as we begin to be established there, it normalizes, it ceases to be extraordinary. Because we've become more familiar with it, more intimate with it. We acclimatize to it.
Yeah.
Francis once gave the analogy of someone who comes back from a trip with a heavy rucksack on their shoulders. They put the rucksack down, and for the first 2 minutes they feel elated and light and liberated and expanded because they no longer have the weight of the rucksack. But 10 minutes later they just feel normal. They were in exactly the same state that they were the moment they put the rucksack down. But they no longer feel elated or expanded. They just feel it's become their new norm. Be open to the possibility that reality, not some abstract philosophical reality that only a few extraordinary people have access to, but the very reality that you and I are currently experiencing. Be open to the possibility that this reality is made out of a single, indivisible, unlimited or infinite, self-aware whole. And that nothing that takes place in experience compromises the integrity of that perfection, that wholeness, that infinite indivisibility. Be open to the possibility that this experience, and that every experience you have, irrespective of its content, is itself the shining of a single, perfect, whole, complete, infinite and indivisible reality. Be open to that possibility. Explore that possibility in your experience. And if you find that there is nothing in your experience that contradicts this possibility, begin to live its implications, live from this point of view, and see how that impacts your experience.